I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us today. We appreciate everybody being here with us. I want to give a short introduction into Strong Hearts. Strong Hearts is a confidential and anonymous helpline dedicated to serving our American Indian and Alaska Native relatives through caller led advocacy. Our hotline is available via call, text, or chat 24/7, 365 days a year. I do have that information for you here in the chat. Please save that information if you need it or if you know anybody else who needs it. My name is Samantha Still. I'm the communications manager for Strong Hearts Native Helpline. I am Pueblo Indian. I am from the Puaque Pueblo tribe in northern New Mexico. Um, I have been in communications for just under 14 years. Most of my experience comes from working closely with my tribe and our tribal offices. Today we have Sandra Pilgrim Lewis with us. I'm going to turn it over to her to give an introduction into who she is and her work in the field when it comes to MMIR, MMIW, domestic and sexual violence, and all. You do a lot, so tell us a bit about your background.
Ihani Waste. I am Sandra Pilgrim Lewis. I'm at Ogala Lakota. It's such an honor to be here with you all today. People ask me how long I've been doing this work, and I tell them I have a life sentence. I currently am the DVS project director for Uniting Three Fires Against Violence, which is Michigan's tribal coalition. But prior to that, I did all things culturally specific and underserved, did a lot of work to diminish barriers for our tribal programs and relatives in the state of Michigan when I worked for the state of Michigan. And prior to that, I was an executive director for dual programs both in Alaska and in Michigan. But I've done this work for probably 60 years. And in a lot of capacities. And when I'm not doing my what I call my real job right now, I've done a lot of technical assistance and training across the continental United States, as it's called now, as well as internationally. And again, it's such an honor to be here with all of you all today. And thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule and lives to join us for this important topic.
Thanks, Sandra. Thank you for being here. I know just as you let everybody know you're busy, and I know you go a lot of different places. You do a lot of different things. So we appreciate you on behalf of Strong Hearts. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We will have some time at the end of this conversation to have some questions. Please use the Q&A box for any questions that you may have throughout this webinar. We'll be monitoring those and hopefully get to everybody's questions. So do not use the chat box for that. Please utilize the Q&A box. I want to go ahead and give a short definition to domestic violence, sexual assault, and MMIR. I know we have quite a bit of people that join us that come from, if you're a caring community member, if you're currently an advocate, if you're just somebody wanting to learn more about what you can do and how you can help those who are suffering from domestic violence, sexual assault, or those that have been suffering from anything to do with missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. Domestic violence is violence committed by a trusted friend, partner, or relative. This violence can include physical violence, financial, emotional, and even cultural abuse. Sexual assault is a type of a sexual contact or behavior that happens without direct consent and can be committed by a partner, relative, stranger, or trusted friend. When it comes to MMIR, we say missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. You're going to hear missing and murdered Indigenous relatives in many different ways. You will hear how we say MMIR, you will hear MMIP, MMIW, MMIWG. The important thing to remember is no matter how you hear it, it all has the same purpose, and that's to highlight the disproportionate violence against our Indigenous women and relatives. Again, you are going to hear MMIR in several different ways, but always remember what the purpose of it is for. We are going to be discussing some pretty heavy topics during this webinar. Again, things related to domestic abuse, sexual assault, and missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. If you are needing help during this time, or if you know somebody who's needing help, please contact Strong Hearts Native Helpline. We have our advocates on the line 24/7, 365 days a year. You can call or text 1-844-762-8483, or you can chat online at strongheartsnativehelpline.org. Again, that information is in the chat for you to access. I do want to take some time to acknowledge that these topics will be heavy. So if you need to step away, or if you can't stay on the webinar any longer, this will be available. It's recorded, so it'll be available on our YouTube channel as well as our social media platforms. All right. With all of that, I am going to just get straight into some of the questions that I have for you, Sandra. Um,
Okay.
the first question I have for you is, how does the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives intersect with issues of domestic and sexual violence in Indigenous communities?
So one of the things I think that we need to remember is that many of our relatives that experience domestic and sexual violence also become victims of becoming murdered and missing, that they're not synonymous, that they happen coinciding, that so many times when our relatives are experiencing domestic violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, they also become victims that we later find out are missing or murdered. The same thing with sexual assault. So we try to, I don't say we, but society tries to silo the issues, and they're not synonymous. They happen together. But a lot of times people are missing and murdered that are not victims of domestic and sexual violence, because it happens to all of our relatives. And I think sometimes we forget that. It happens to our fathers and our brothers and our grandpas too, who we
Mhm.
don't necessarily think about the domestic and sexual violence piece. But many, many times they're interconnected because we're so vulnerable, um, that perpetrators of the violence don't look at us as fully human. They look at us like exotic dolls, and so they don't, that experience of harming a human being isn't there, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But the crimes are so interconnected in many ways.
Yeah, thanks for touching on that. I do think it's important to realize that these things can happen together, but they also happen apart. There's a lot of situations that you'll see where somebody is in a relationship with a partner who thinks that they just want to be, boyfriend and girlfriend and be exclusive, but then it turns into wanting to, traffic this person or do other things, and that turns into being missing or murdered, or they live together, but they can also live apart. So thanks for acknowledging that. And the other question I have is, what are some of the root causes behind the high rates of violence against Indigenous people?
I this is one of those places, and it kind of intersects with our historical trauma,
Mm,
and I always want to share this with people to understand that it goes back for hundreds and thousands of years. And I like to talk about the doctrine of discovery, that in the early 1400s, there were papal bulls. The Catholic popes wrote papal bulls that said wherever white Christian men went and discovered lands that were not um, governed by or occupied by other white Christian men, that white Christian men would have control over those lands, that they would have right of discovery, that the indigenous people who live there would only have right of occupancy like a bird in the air or a fish in the water, and that we would be less than human and would to be subservient to the white Christian men who came.
mhm,
And so when Christopher Columbus, oh my goodness, was lost at sea looking for India and came to the Americas. He felt it was okay, and in the name of the Queen and in the name of the church, massacred so many of our relatives because they were less than human, and he had the right of discovery to the lands and the people because they were seen as less than human. And so the Queen of England, at the time when they were coming to look at what's now called the United States, was excommunicated from the Catholic Church, but she took that doctrine of discovery to say, go in to Sir Walter Raleigh, go in my name, and wherever there is no English white prince, then in my name will you take possession of that land. And so when we go back and look at what is foundational, we understand that coming into the places where we live, coming to Turtle Island, coming and seeing Mother Earth as a possession and us as less than human, that it is so a root cause of the violence because we're not seen as human. We're seen as subservient. We're seen as less than. And so all the laws, all of the Western laws, whether you go back to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, were always eliminated or seen as less than. And so it is violence with impunity. And I think that when we think about those things, it upholds the okayness of it. It's almost a right. It's okay to violate our relatives, that it doesn't hold the same kind of moral or legal consequence as it would be if you were going to violate what they would see as a human being. And and I just think that if we don't understand foundationally the laws and the purpose behind how we got here, then we're never going to understand what upholds it.
Yeah, I think that knowing the history of that is really important. I think it's also important as a Native woman myself, we don't really read this in history books, right? This is not something that is readily available. That's why we depend as people on stories of our ancestors or stories of our elders. So I appreciate the historical context behind that. I also wanted to touch a little bit about you mentioned during the first question I asked that we're kind of looked at as like a I think you said like a doll of of sorts, right? And so when it comes to like root causes of like our our culture is kind of what is the word I'm looking for? Used in a way in a sexually exploitive way when you look at things like costumes and people wearing headdresses and different things like this, and so we're made into to a costume, and things who are made into costumes are things that are not looked at to be real or and are almost like these fictional characters, right? Um,
Right?
so I wanted to touch on that, and then also the very complicated jurisdictional issues and um, the feeling that people have of being able to get away from victimizing our brothers and sisters because of the complexities behind the jurisdictional um, issues that we face as Native people.
Yeah, you talked about the dolls again. And so part of it is that when we're looked at as these dolls, these uh, very elegant dolls, and that's how we're looked at.
Mhm,
And so when we feel we have a voice, okay, and
mhm.
we talk back or we fight back, it really, it's not our fault, but I mean, like, what do you mean you're a doll? And I'm tired of you, and I'll put you on the shelf, and I'll only take you down when I want you. And
Mhm.
when that doesn't work, it just exacerbates the violence. And then when we add in the jurisdictional pieces, and people will say often, well, you all have VAWA now. Well, if you think about that, there are 574 federally recognized tribes, and approximately 10% of those tribes have been able to implement VAWA. So that means the rest of those tribal lands, if you go on those lands and you rape our relatives, it's violence with impunity because our courts and our law enforcement have no jurisdiction over the non-native perpetrators. And when
Mhm.
we look at what the statistics tell us, that we're more often violated by non-natives than by our relatives.
Mhm.
And it's just it's heartbreaking. And if you Google us, all the pictures you see of our Native women are so sexualized,
Mhm.
or either they're pictures from way back a long time ago when we were living in teepees, and people either see us as invisible, or we just we're not still seen as living, breathing human beings with minds, bodies, and rights. We just don't have those things. And so these things keep carrying forward. And the jurisdictional issues are just mind staggering when you think about it, that that violence happens with impunity, that you could that's why it's called the hunting grounds. You
Mhm.
just go onto tribal land and rape and kill and do all of these things to our relatives with no consequence. Because
Yeah.
if you think, I think about where I live. Um, okay, at the Sioux, let's talk about Sault Ste. Marie. And the if you're dependent on the Sioux tribe that has implemented VAWA, but let's say it was pre-VAWA, the closest BIA or FBI office would be, or a federal court, that would be Marquette. And in the summertime, that's 3.5 hours away. In the
Wow.
wintertime, what is that? In the middle of a blizzard, if you could get there at all. And so
Mhm.
when we think about how vast our lands are, if we think about the Dene, the Navajo Nation, how big that land is, and I think about, and this is an example I get people to think about. So when COVID was at its height, and the process, they kept saying, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands.
Mhm.
Think about our Janae relatives living in the desert who don't even have water to drink. And the answer was, wash your hands. We weren't being considered. We're not being considered on any level. So when we think about all of those things, one thing on top of another thing on top of another thing, um, yeah, it's just mind boggling to me. And there's no wonder that the violence is so big and that we go missing and murdered so often, um, because there's so many barriers, and the jurisdiction is just such a small piece of it. Well, it seems small, but it really is the glue that holds it together, I feel like.
Yeah, I think a lot of people also tend to forget that although, VAWA is enacted, it's a fairly new it's fairly new. It's not old at all, and so it does take some time to, put those things in place, and also not forgetting, our, brothers and sisters who live in Alaska, right? There's
Mm.
a huge disproportionate amount of law enforcement and resources out in the Alaska Native area. I mean, it takes days for law enforcement to get there. Some of these tribes are only accessible by boat or plane or whatever it may be. So if something does happen where law enforcement is required, you have to be prepared to wait days on end to receive any sort of assistance at all. So the access to resources that we have are few and far between. Um, But that kind of goes into my next question about how can we educate both indigenous and non-indigenous populations about the unique challenges faced by indigenous communities in terms of safety and justice?
Okay, well, I saw it pop up on the screen and it kind of plays into that about MMIR within the urban communities.
Mhm,
And that's a really big issue too, because so many of us don't live on our reservation or trust lands, and
mhm,
that we live within urban communities. So when we go murdered and missing, if our bodies are found, we're not even identified as being indigenous. It's like whatever, because we don't have this single look, like everybody native looks like this. It's wherever we are, in whatever group we're in, that's how we're identified. So we might be identified as Latina, we might be identified as African American, we might be identified as Asian. We're so far down the line that if our bodies are found, that they identify us as being one of our relatives. And we forget that 70% of us live in urban areas, and that's connected back to relocation, boarding schools, all of the intentional acts and laws that were passed to break apart our communities and our tribes. Um, Now I forgot where I was going with this question. I'm sorry.
you're okay. Um,
But yeah, go on.
yeah, I think it's important. I did see the urban communities come through. It's important to note that there are a lot more of us Native Americans or Alaskan Natives in urban communities than there are even that reside on our tribal lands. So that's a great question. Who asked the question? Michelle, that was a great question. Um, you had mentioned something that I wanted to touch on. Oh, the fact that when we do have, a murdered and missing Indigenous relatives case, you said a lot of us are marked as Latina, Asian, whatever it may be, and oftentimes we're the other statistic that you
Mhm,
see on pieces of data is, you can mark African American, Latina, and then there's other. And most of the time we're that other piece of data that you're seeing when data is presented. Um, and also I think it's a thing that being missing and murdered Indigenous relative is not really acknowledged as much as we would like it to be, and a lot of the times we're looked at like we ran away from our situation, or it was a case of self-harming or whatever it may be, so it's not often looked at to be that you were murdered by
mhm.
somebody else. It's always, "Oh, something else happened." Um, and so that is in itself a barrier that we face of not being recognized for what is actually happening within our communities.
Yeah, I think about, MUSAC did their Garden of Truth study,
Mhm,
and I think that we just don't think about how much it happens to our relatives. And last year, I went to the Legacy Museum, and it's dedicated to slavery and what happened to the slaves. And they have a display with all of these heads of people that died in crossing the ocean,
mhm,
of the slaves that didn't make it. And I thought when I read Garden of Truth, and because I live so close to Lake Superior, I thought about if someone did something like that for our relatives, how many heads would they need to create of our Native women relatives that have been drowned in Lake Superior, that are MMI are, that were part of trafficking
mhm,
and were connected to sexual violence. And so it's so under and unreported what happens to us because it's not important. But when we see young white women who go murdered and missing, it's on the news every day,
Mhm,
every day, every day. But our relatives, we don't hear about it. Like you said, if it's our teens, it's like, oh, well, they were just a runaway or
mhm,
they were just this or that. And, I will be the first person to say that every missing person isn't murdered because I can't give examples from my family that are that. But it is so underreported and so unrecognized throughout society
mhm.
how much it happened. And I think about when I lived in Alaska and the villages are so isolated. And like you said, it's so long before someone comes, and how many of us turn up murdered in our urban communities and we're checked as other or something else, and nobody knows. And how many times we sit with the surviving relatives that never know what happened to us. It's it is at an epidemic level, and nobody acknowledges or recognizes that.
Yeah, I wanted to take a second and we got a good question from one of our attendees. Um, Catherine asks, "What are our action steps and how do we affect change?"
Okay, our action steps as the I always say that the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And culturally, we're not a squeaky wheel people. We're really a quiet person. And so I think that we have to continue to raise our voices and we have to let people know. And so we have to create strategies. And so, how is it that we do that within our local communities? How do we bring groups together, and how do we force mainstream media to recognize what's happening within our communities? Some things have happened, and we have to remember to celebrate the things that have happened. We have to celebrate that we have VOWA. We have to celebrate that we have Savannah's Act. But I don't, and I include myself, how aware are we of the things that have passed that can help us, and how active are we in um, raising awareness within our states, within our nations of the issue, and asking for ways how can we collectively come together and work on these things. So within Michigan, within our Attorney General's office, we now have a working group that is actively working on um, addressing MMIR, and has hired a person to help our communities heal over boarding schools, because we forget that so many people who went to the boarding schools were murdered or missing, and really raise awareness to the issues. So I think one of the biggest things we can do is celebrate when we have steps going forward, and to find ways to be a collective to raise awareness to the issues. If you can write a letter to the editor, um, if you can post something, if you can find a group to come together to support people within your community and raise awareness, that is so important. And it may seem like a small thing, but really the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And if we think it doesn't, look at what's happening in our world today, when just people becoming aware of a few things happening, and a lot of us raising our voices and making a lot of noises, then we're seeing change.
Mhm,
So it's hard sometimes to be the loudmouth, but we just have to do that. And we have to keep raising awareness in every venue we can find, and get people to listen to us so that they know this is real and it's happening to our relatives. And we want to keep asking for accountability.
I actually really love that you said we must celebrate. I think oftentimes it's easy for us to look at the very long road that we have ahead of us as people because of all the things that still need work or need to be done. But being proud of what our elders have done and even our ancestors to make sure that we have things like you mentioned, Savannah's Act, VAWA, the fact that MMIR, MMIW, MMIP is such a um nationwide movement, if you will. And I've started seeing it more and more probably within the past 5, 6 years. I know it's been around for a while now, but people are becoming more comfortable with speaking about the uncomfortable topics, right? And so I really love that you said that we must celebrate because we have to take those small victories and those small wins because without them there would be no push for change. Um, and her question was went into my next one, which was what can we do as a community to raise awareness about the epidemic of MMIR and the link to domestic and sexual violence. We did talk a little bit about what we can do as a community. And you mentioned a couple things. I just wanted to also mention, talking to your tribal leaders. I think for me specifically, this is not a MMIR, domestic violence, sexual violence is not it's an uncomfortable topic. Therefore, it's not a topic that is often brought up in our small tribe, and oftentimes things that are made into jokes or that are joked about, or even see this not even just in your communities but on social media and things like that. So starting these conversations and being aware of how we talk about these things happening within our circles. But do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think about John Trudeau. He was such an amazing man, and he said, "You're struggling so hard to learn the old ways when all you have to do is remember. All you have to do is remember. Allow ourselves to remember our grandmother teachings, to remember our histories, to remember who we are, what our cultures are, and to bring those messages in a way that honor who we are, who
Mhm,
our ancestors were. And remember that each one of us is part of a seventh generation. And when we do that, it gives us a power that we forget that we have.
mhm,
And so I encourage you to know who you are, to know who your ancestors were, and to remember on whose shoulders you stand, and to know that we don't just do this work for us today, that we're doing it for those who haven't come yet and those who are going to be our future. And I think when we remember that and to do it in that culturally honoring way, it can make such a difference. And it also helps people see us as the incredible, incredible people that we are. And it helps to wash away that we're less than human because we're amazing people no matter what tribe you're from. We're amazing people with amazing cultures and histories. And so we have to get folks to see that we are human. We are amazing, 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 amazing people. And we each have a name and understand that our names give us a responsibility. My English name is Sandra, and it means helper of mankind. I always say, why didn't they name me Mary or Violet or somebody? But they didn't. They named me helper of mankind. And so I try to remember that and looking for opportunities. And I read something the other day and it said, life is, or the world is a book, and that there's a chapter just for you. And so, what are you going to do with your chapter? How are you going to make this a better world for the next generations? And I just want to encourage you all because I know everybody that's listening um, has amazing powers and that you can use those powers to do the work and celebrate and encourage others. And I just know you're going to do that. And Um, you're on your way to being wonderful ancestors for new generations.
That was beautifully put. I also want to acknowledge, our attendees here. You guys are part of the change. You guys are here today because you either want to learn more or you are a loved one supporting somebody going through this. So you want to be that that root of support for them. And so these are ways that you can help support your community, is learning more about the impacts on communities around you, the impacts of the people nationwide, because we all are on different. I'm in New Mexico, Sandra's in Michigan, so we're all from different corners, but we all have shared experiences. um, so the next question, what resources or support systems do Indigenous communities need to help prevent violence, including domestic and sexual violence?
So I think that takes us back, I believe takes us back that we have our cultures and that there's this there's this billboard that I pass when I'm driving to Sault Ste. Marie, and it has these youth in a canoe, and it has the elders on the shore calling out to them, and the elders are calling, culture is prevention. And so we have our culture and we have our blood memories,
Mhm.
and those things will help us through. And I think that we forget that. And we have our elders, and we have our cultural teachers and our spiritual leaders, that when we apply those things to our social activism and teaching, that we have some things that the Western world doesn't have. And I think that when we add that and remember the journeys that we've come through, Crazy Horse is from my nation. And I read this thing about Crazy Horse not long ago. And he said the Western people killed the buffalo because they understood what the buffalo meant to us. And he talked about how we took the buffalo hides and we made our structures out of it. And so no matter how cold the weather got or how high the wind would blow, if we were inside of a buffalo structure, that we would be in quiet. It would keep the sound of the wind out. It would keep the cold out. And we would always be safe as long as we were inside that buffalo structure, that buffalo hide structure. But when the colonizers came, they wanted to give us canvas tents, canvas teepees. And inside that canvas, the wind would blow, it would be noisy, we would be cold, it wouldn't keep us safe. And so, what that says to me is if we can lean into our blood memories, our culture, our traditional ways, and do it in the traditional ways, which is really hard. It's really hard. I think it's what John Trudeau was saying. You try so hard to recapture the old ways when all you got to do is remember. If we can do that, we have the power to overcome the challenges, to do what we need to do to create change, to educate ourselves, to bring ourselves together as community. Because as relatives, we're people of community. We take care of each other. And that's what's kind of been lost sometimes. So, working on bringing ourselves together, back together as the community, caring for each other, being the eyes of each other and the ears of each other, and regaining that and making sure that's in the center of this work that we're doing to raise awareness around stopping the violence. Because in our traditional ways, women were sacred, children were sacred, our elders were sacred. This violence was not a part of who we were, that was part of colonization. So, remembering and bringing back our sacredness and putting away the things that were put upon us and regaining who we are.
Yeah, I like the way that you put that, kind of going back to your root and reconnecting with those those around you. I do. I like that. Um, I also think, and I'm gonna plug Strong Hearts in here, and not only do I love the work that I do here, but I love what we stand for, right? We are the first Native American and Alaska Native helpline dedicated to serving our relatives. We are caller-led, we're confidential and anonymous. Caller-led advocacy is something that is really important to us because we have advocates on the line who are ready to listen to you and help you make the steps that you're ready to make. Something that our CEO likes to say is that people calling us who are experiencing domestic or sexual abuse already have somebody telling them what they need to do. They don't need us to tell them what to do. They just need us to listen and understand what they're going through, listen to their barriers, listen to what steps they're ready to take and what steps they can realistically take. So I think more um, culturally relevant resources are definitely needed within our communities, within this nation. So more services like Strong Hearts Native Helpline are important resources
Mhm.
to have and to connect with, and also know that these services exist. Right, growing up in a small reservation, I know about our resources on our in our tribe. I was never aware of those external resources that are out there to help. So, knowing about services like ours and spreading the word and um, just being aware of what's out there to help you and that you're not alone. Um, I have time for one more question, and then we'll take some questions. We have quite a few questions from our attendees. So the last question I have is, how can we ensure that the voices of those most affected by MMIR and violence, especially survivors, are heard and respected in conversations and decision-making processes?
No, we have to make room at the table. Um, when we get opportunities to go to tables and speak, we need to make sure that the voices who've experienced the violence are there to give them the space and the way they want to speak to be there, to make whatever works for them, whether it's through social media posts, whether it's during powwows or ceremonies, or when we're invited to speak. It's not our voices to speak for people, but for the people who've experienced the violence to have a place to speak. We were doing some talking circles one time, and a young woman said, "It's not my job to educate systems when I'm in the throes of my trauma." And so, how is it that we help her find the way to tell those systems that when she's not in the throes of her trauma, but making opportunities for everyone to have a voice? And, culturally, that's the way we did things a long time ago, not because I'm an advocate for a long time, feel like I can tell systems or groups or folks outside of our immediate community what it's like or what I think the needs are. Remember to listen. Creator gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and to use those 2 ears more than we use that 1 mouth. Make sure that we're making opportunities and pathways for victims and survivors and those and their families to have a voice to say, "This is what we need," and not make decisions for them. Because if that's what we're doing, then we're no different from colonizers. Remember, remember, we're part of community and we have 2 ears. Creator gave us 2 ears and use those 2 ears so much more than we use that 1 mouth.
I Everything you say always brings me back into my next topic, so I love how we're connecting this way. But I agree with you. Storytelling is the way of our people, right? That's how we learn about our past. That's how we learn about the struggles that our ancestors faced. And so listening is really important and something that I think us as people are good at, but often sometimes we can be a little bit better at by giving those who just need a space to speak, and you just sit and listen, because they are the ones who know what they need. They are the ones who know what's going to help them. They are the ones that know what help they're ready to receive. So I do like how you said Creator gave us two ears and one mouth. Use the two ears more than you use the one mouth. I think that's a perfect way to put it. And goes into one last thing that I'd like to mention before we take Q and A's. Everybody will be receiving a follow-up email after our webinar here. One of the things that we're going to be attaching is a Google document that is going to give you the option. I know during this conversation, it's going to bring up some stories of you wanting to share and have your story be told and have a space for somebody to listen to you. The Google document that we're going to send out is going to give you an option to share your story with Strong Hearts. You can select that you want to share this story with everybody, or you could just need a space to just share what you're going through. The survey is or the document is anonymous, so you have the option to share your identity with us, or you have the option to just put your story there and get it out. But that is the way that we're able to connect with our people is by sharing lived experiences. And so if you feel inclined to share your story, you'll get that follow-up email and there will be a Google document attached to that for you to go ahead and share what you feel you'd like to share. We're going to take a couple questions from our audience and then I'm going to put a poll out. This poll is very helpful for Strong Hearts and my team to know who we're connecting with, how you heard about us, and some future topics that you would like to see us discuss. And so I'll put that out at the very end of our webinar here. I have one question from Lily. Lily says or asks, do you think that putting an emphasis on self-defense would make a difference? Anything from martial arts to getting a concealed carry permit?
Well, I think that that's questions for you to ask your community and the women that you work with. There are places that think that's a really good idea and it works really well, but I don't think that there's a one size fits all for any any group. So that's one of those places that, and this is just my opinion. Yes, I can't tell you what's right for you, but I think that's a place that you engage with your community and the people that you work with and the people that you serve and say, is this something that you think would be helpful for you? Because there's some communities that I've worked with who felt like that's been really helpful and they've taken that path. And there's other communities who said, no, they want to take a different path. So again, I think it's really important that you engage with the community where you live and work, the people that you serve, and see, is this something that you feel will be helpful for you? And if they don't feel like it's helpful for them, then you want to talk about what would be helpful for you. It's about what works within your community and what do those most impacted feel like they want to do.
I agree with your answer. I think it's not a one size fits all type of thing and really asking around as to what works for those in your community or even for yourself is going to be important. Um, an anonymous attendee says, do you have best practices to address the commodification of MMIR, such as selling shirts, fashion shows with profits being kept, etc.? And we have so many known abusers slash predators in leadership spaces or in honored positions at the drum conducting ceremony. But when we as women try to call them in or call them out, then we are attacked. What are specific things that have worked to make it safer in other urban settings? So it's kind of a two
Yeah.
question.
So, like every person on the drum isn't a perpetrator. So who are the people on that drum who are not? And how do you engage with them to be the voice, to walk with you and talk with you and walk beside you? Um, because our single voice sometimes isn't the one, but who is our partner and our ally? And that's always been really helpful for me because every spiritual leader isn't the one. And I see you've chased several perpetrators. Yeah, I know, like, Andy Jackson is a really wise woman in our area, and she was on tribal council at one of the tribes for a while, and she chased them down and chased them out too. But she also says at the same time, who are the strong men within our community that will walk beside us? Because we have to understand what community means for us in our traditional ways, and how do we bring our community together? And that's learning who are the good men? Who are the good men in your community? Because there are some, and you get them to walk with you and speak too, because it takes more than our voices as women. It takes learning who are the good men in our communities, because there are good men in our communities, and have them join you in bringing that message. Because when it's the other person on that drum saying, no, 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 shame, shame, you don't belong here, it makes a very big difference.
Mhm. We have another anonymous question that says, "Can you tell us more?" Oh, because you mentioned, can you tell us more about blood memories?
So blood gosh, blood memories are things that we have that we forget that we have. And so sometimes that it's a smell that wakes up for you. And so I'll tell you about a blood memory for me. When I was a little girl, my Uchi, my grandmother, would take me and we would pick bergamot and we would make bergamot tea. And it was one of the lessons I had with her that I had forgotten. She gave me so many lessons, and then I just didn't remember that one. And then I went to um, like an event thing, and the person who was leading the event was talking about women's medicines and things, and she gave us all bergamot tea and showed us how to make it. And when I smelt the smell, the memory was awakened for me. And I remember when she given that to me, and remembered the teaching she gave with me, but it was buried within me. And so sometimes their words will be said and smells will come up, and those are our blood memories. Those are things that we don't remember anybody teaching us, but are in our ancestral memories. That's just one that I can remember when she teaching me, but there are just plants that I will taste and touch and smell and remember that I have no idea why I remember those things. And there are teachings that I know that I should do, and when I don't do those things, I get a icky feeling inside of me. And those are blood memories. Those are things that um, colonization should have taken away from us, but that we still carry those things. And those are what blood memories are. And that's the words that we use for them. And there's been scientific studies that prove those things are real. At the University of Michigan, they did it in conjunction with trauma. They had some field mice and they fed them all cherries. And half of them, every time they fed them the cherries, they would give them a little electrical shock. And then when they had babies, every time the babies would smell cherries, they'd go into shock. They'd have trauma response, and they were carrying the memories from their mothers who had been shocked every time they were given cherries. So we all carry blood memories in our DNA, and we don't know that. And that's part of what John Trudeau was saying. You're working so hard to learn the old ways when all you have to do is remember, because they're buried deep within our subconscious. And sometimes, if we can just take the time and sit quiet and know what it is we want to do, those things will come to us. But on your life journey, you'll like, I don't know why I know this smell is familiar to me, or this taste, or this touch, or this place, when you have no other connections to it. And so I hope that's helpful to you when we talk about blood memories.
That's very insightful. I've experienced that as well, but didn't know that there was a name. attached to it. I just thought, "Oh, it's a memory," and for some reason, I don't remember this memory until I smell something, or I get a whiff of something and it makes you physically feel a type of way, but then also makes you remember. So thanks for sharing that. There's one more that I do wanna ask, and then we'll launch the poll. We have about 3 minutes left, but I do think that this is an important question. An anonymous attendee says or asks, "What advice do you have for Native women who are just now starting to work in this field, such as a case manager or advocate? How can they make the biggest difference?"
I'm going to say again, Creator gave you 2 ears and one mouth. Listen wisely. And when you don't know, don't be afraid to say, I don't know, and reach out to someone to help you on your journey. And honestly, I think the biggest impact we can make is when we give someone the space to tell their story and listen without judgment, and support them. Of the many women and men and children I've encountered over the years, was honoring them to hear their story, um, just honoring them as a person and a human being is one of the greatest gifts you can ever give anyone.
Lori says, "Thank you." Yes, Cedra, thank you for sharing, like Lori says, your knowledge and your wisdom. We're gonna launch the poll because I see the attendees, it's going down a little bit, so I wanna make sure we get that out. So if we can go ahead and get that launched now. Awesome. While they're doing that, Sandra, yes, I just want to thank you. Thank you for meeting with me over several days. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being open-minded. Thank you for having this conversation. Thank you for being a teacher and a leader. You've definitely given me some things to think about and reflect on myself internally. I hope everybody who's joined us today is able to take something away from what we've talked about, and I hope that we've made a difference as two Native women, and I hope that we made an impact on those listening to us today. I just want to send another gentle reminder that some of the things that we talked about today were some tough topics. There were some words in there that can be triggering to certain individuals. If you need help or you know somebody who needs help, Strong Hearts Native Helpline is here 24/7, 365 days a year. You can call or text 1-844-762-8483, or you can chat online at strongheartshelpline.org.